There are some changes that can happen swiftly, but much sustainable change takes much longer than we may at first think it will.
Welcome to a brand new episode of Starts at the Top, our podcast about leading differently. I'm Paul Thomas.
And I'm Zoe Amma. Our podcast exists to help leaders and their teams understand what they need to do differently today to prepare for the world of tomorrow. We started Starts at the Top as a podcast about digital disruption, but we soon realised that leaders were telling us about something more important and more urgent, about how traditional ways of leading had changed forever.
We make it our mission to speak to leaders who are carving out new ways of leading, and we cover topics from emerging tech to inclusion, from remote work to mental health and climate change. Basically, all of the subjects that today's leaders need to be across in 2024.
And this isn't about shiny corporate case studies. It's about lessons learned and progress made the hard way, and crucially, how that can inspire others.
In this episode, we're sharing a really lovely and warm conversation that we had with John May, who is Chief Executive of Cats Protection. He works with over 1,000 staff and 10,000 volunteers at Cats Protection. And the Cats Protection vision is to nurture a society where every cat leads their best possible life because they are protected, cared for, and understood by everyone. I am very much a cat person and was quite excited about this one. Through lockdown, we Team Thomas rehomed a beautiful cat called Prince, who very much helped us to get through lockdown. Prince was sadly killed in 2022, but Cats Protection is a charity that we continue to support. So it was a pleasure to speak to John. And so talking of getting through tricky times, what a week it was last week with the US elections, helping to prove that despite nearly 80 episodes of this podcast and interviews and conversations with leaders from all different places in the universe, we still know very, very little, or still understand very, very little about leadership and what makes a good leader that people want to follow. I mean, who knew?
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those bits of news that kind of seems inevitable when you look at it through the rear view mirror, but perhaps none of us could have anticipated the extent to which his supporter base came out for him, and that in itself is really interesting, and it's also something we might be reflecting on with a upcoming guest, all being well, without saying too much about that. But yeah, I mean, this is someone who's absolutely ripped up the rule book of how a leader traditionally communicates, and also how they lead to some extent as well, whatever you think of his morals. So that in itself is a bit of a case study for how leadership is evolving, which is obviously a big theme of what we talk about on this podcast. So it will be fascinating and also worrying as well to see how things develop.
Yeah, I think the most surprising thing about it all was that it was completely unsurprising. And despite everything that I listened to in the weeks ahead of the election that gave me so much hope for a different outcome, sadly that didn't come to pass at all, and we are where we are, I guess, with it all. And I think it took a lot of people, not by surprise, as I said, but I think a lot of people were hit quite hard by it. There was quite a strong reaction across the social media that I still interact with, and certainly in WhatsApp groups and conversations that I have, a sort of a little bit of a depression setting in. And I think there was an interesting post that you shared from Ian Dunt, who has been on this podcast, where he was sort of ruminating on what it all meant. And I think it was helpful because he made me stop sort of taking the attitude that America is broken and aren't they all silly over there because they've made a silly decision. And he really made me sort of reflect on, people in glass houses should not be throwing stones. And we are just as culpable in all of this as the US is.
Yeah, it's a really good blog post, and actually, I'll put the link in the show notes because I found it very reassuring when I came across it last week. Big fan of Ian Dunt, obviously, and very lucky to have had him on the podcast previously. I think he talks a lot of good sense. I found this so helpful that I actually put it on our team Slack, which is probably where you saw it, Paul. And the reason why I think it's such a good read at a time like this is that Ian reflects on this huge world event from a very personal perspective. He talks about how it's okay to feel a sense of despair. It's okay to feel worried and actually try not to get involved in some of the very binary, really difficult conversations about politics that go on online, especially around a moment like this, and how it's okay to feel a bit angry and to also to try and hang on to that sense of hope where you can, right, that there are still people who want to do good in the world, who have good intentions. And actually, you know, in terms of who voted for Trump, there'll be, you know, people who might have done for some very, very complex reasons, even if we ourselves wouldn't have voted for him. So I think it's all about understanding the context, isn't it? And what kind of leader is particularly appealing to people when they feel kind of desperate and that they're out of options, and perhaps the alternative doesn't resonate with them as much as it could do. And we need to understand why that is as well.
Yeah, and it also speaks to the power of a good, strong opposition as well, doesn't it? And we saw that in this country, that really in the end there was no choice. But I think the interesting thing will be, you know, things like how he forms his government and the shift of power there. We were talking just before we came on about Elon Musk and linking that to social media. You know, Elon Musk runs Twitter, or what's now called X, and I think there's some danger that that platform will dissipate into absolutely nothing. And I even heard rumours that Trump's Truth Social might even be in a position to buy X, which would be an absolute disaster. But Elon Musk joining his government, perhaps as head of head of a government efficiency commission. You shared this with me just before we came on, and that sounds like well, Musk is very good at spending money. Is he good at saving it? I don't know.
Yeah, so this was a news story that's been floating around, and I believe I first heard about it on there. Might have been either the news agents or the Rest is Politics podcast. But we have got a link to it from The Independent, actually, and we'll pop that in the show notes. So Trump says that he's going to ask Elon Musk, according to this article, to run a government efficiency commission, and that could include drastic spending cuts. So it sounds like Musk would be sent in there as a bit of a slash and burn guy. And it would be interesting to understand, you know, what he's going to focus on when he does that. I guess we will find out in due course, won't we? But I think it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, we talked about Elon Musk on this podcast many times before, but how Elon Musk might actually go about doing that in a way that I think is going to be very, very different in government compared to how you might do it in a corporate. And also bearing in mind Musk's records of what he has done at X as well, and how that's working out for him in terms of profitability as well. So yes, it will be interesting to see how this develops for sure.
Well, ultimately, I guess if he sells it to Trump, then he's won again, hasn't he? And again, we'll probably have to do an episode on how we don't understand the economics of social media anymore. It just seems to be that he's created a place where nobody wants to go apart from Trump supporters in the end, and it might be that might be the way he turns a profit finally. But talking about the sort of the financial side of all of this, I had a conversation on Friday with the person that looks after my pension and he was sort of talking about how my pension was geared towards, or far probably too much geared towards US stocks, and that we probably needed to make a change, but we wouldn't do it for now because the immediate aftermath of the election probably meant that interest rates were going to be low, businesses were going to do well, and therefore my money, my pension, was going to do well for me as well. And it wouldn't have been the case, or it probably wouldn't have been the case, in a government run by Kamala, which is really quite worrying because the moral dilemma that sort of sits there, where you think, is this why he is so popular in the US, that he's good for low taxes, he's good for business, and ultimately he's good for the financial stability of that country? Is that why he's in the position he's in? But it really did make me think on Friday about all sorts of things, but very much the moral position of having money invested in the US at a time like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because if you make a decision like that, none of these things happen in isolation, do they? Because the government is one thing, but there are also going to be lots of good, hard-working people in the US who would be affected if we all took our money out of there. And obviously not everyone voted for Trump as well. So yeah, it's a really really difficult one. I suppose what you can look at, I don't want to turn this into a financial advice podcast, Paul, because I'm not Martin Lewis, in case you hadn't noticed. But I suppose you could look at what your funds invest in specifically, like areas of investment, and move out of anything more unpalatable. But yeah, I'll leave it to Martin Lewis to give actual proper financial advice. I'm really working above my pay grade there, such as it is.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep an eye on it all. We'll see how it all pans out. And I think the world will be keeping an eye on what happens next, particularly as all the noise seems to be about the war between Ukraine and Russia and the moves that he's making there. So we will keep an eye on it. But for now, here is our conversation with John May.
John May is the Chief Executive of Cats Protection, a campaigner, storyteller, writer, teacher, urban cyclist, occasional long-distance runner, habitual chocolate cake eater, and mischief maker who has spent his career supporting and leading voluntary, educational and charitable organisations in the United Kingdom and around the world. He works with the 1,000 staff and 10,000 volunteers of Cats Protection, along with businesses, government and local communities, to create a world where every cat is treated with kindness and an understanding of its needs. Trained first as an actor and then as a teacher, John has worked in a variety of situations, ranging from schools in suburban England to refugee camps in Uganda. He speaks and writes on leadership and volunteering, drawing on his wide experience. He became a head teacher at 28, going on to develop a reputation for regenerating underperforming schools. John has since been the National Educational Director of Business in the Community, founding Chief Executive of Career Ready, Chief Executive of Young Enterprise, and Global Secretary General of the Duke of Edinburgh's International Award. John is a Stonewall ambassador, part of a growing group helping Stonewall continue their vital work for acceptance without exception for all lesbian, gay, bi and trans people in the UK and abroad. John, it's an honour to have you here on Start to the Top. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Zoe, it's lovely to be here.
So we're delighted to have this time with you, and we were just saying before we started recording that obviously it's, we met a few years ago, I think back in the day when you were at Duke of Edinburgh, and it was really exciting to see where you were taking the organisation at that time. You're now obviously at Cats Protection, and you've got an exciting new direction of travel, looking at things like the brand and advocacy and education work. It would be lovely to hear a bit about how that's all going and where you're going with it next.
Oh gosh, well, I don't know about a new direction of travel. I think it's building on nearly 100 years of service to an amazing species. And cats are just the most wonderful things. I'm nutty about them. Blenheim is my cat, black and white, tuxedo cat, upstairs at the moment, refuses to come into any room where I might be working, has a good work-life balance, I think. But the charity itself, I think, does the most extraordinary work and has done so, as I say, for nearly 100 years. And there's an opportunity to do a great deal more. And the real shift, I think, is around recognizing that if, as a charity, we limit ourselves to the traditional activities, important though they are, of rehoming cats and supporting managing the cat population of the UK, then we're only kind of doing a small amount of the job. There's a really important job to be done to help the general population of the UK to understand this extraordinary species, and for them to look after their own cats even better than they think they currently do. And one of the most obvious examples of that I can think of is I've been a cat owner for 40 years, I guess. And I had cats when I was growing up. And it wasn't until I came to work at Cats Protection and spoke to some of the experts within the charity, and we have some amazing experts, that I discovered that I had been looking after the food and water of my cats completely wrongly for all the time that I've been looking after animals. So did you know, here we go, did you know that you should keep a cat's water away from its food? A cat will be much happier if you keep its water about 2 meters away from its food, because genetically cats have evolved. The domestic cat has evolved from a wild cat of the north of Africa, and cats like to keep their prey away from their water so that the two don't contaminate each other. So all these firms that sell 2 feeding bowls side by side, and you put one with food and one with water, you're actually giving a cat something that naturally it's really uncomfortable with. I moved Blenheim's water and suddenly he drank loads more, was much happier, and I learned a great deal. So there we are. There's an example of the sorts of things we can do. And I think there's a real opportunity for us to work with owners around the UK for them to better understand their cats so that their cats have a happier life.
That sounds like something that there's such a strong need for at the moment as well. So what are you going to do to create that change?
Well, we have an amazing voluntary organisation of 10,000 volunteers and about 1,000 staff working together to achieve the sorts of aims that I've been talking about. And I think one of the challenges for any organisation at the moment is to work out what a great voluntary organisation should really look like at this point in history. I mean, if I think back 100 years, voluntary organisations were truly organisations that were owned by and run exclusively by volunteers with almost no staff support at all. If you look at the 70s and 80s, you begin to see a professionalisation of the sector and the involvement of expert, both in terms of the mission of charities, but also in terms of running organisations. And I think there's a new partnership. I know that's a bit of an overworked and hackneyed term, but I'm going to stick with it. I think there's a new partnership to forge between those that are paid to support a charity and those that donate their time and their talent to make a difference. And with Cats Protection, we have an opportunity to make that pop and really make the most of it. And so what we've been doing is looking at every aspect of the charity over the last 18 months and beyond, and before that, before I joined the organisation, in the creation of a strategy that shifts that work from the two traditional areas I spoke about a little earlier to that much wider set of responsibilities. And what we're now doing is looking and seeing how all our people, so whether they be paid or unpaid, can work together to make a difference to cats.
So that's fascinating to us, because volunteering has been something that we've covered in a couple of other episodes. And that really speaks to some of the conversations that are going on in the sector at the moment, doesn't it? As you say about, well, how can we better work with volunteers? How can we recruit more volunteers? So can you tell us about that partnership, and whether that's organisationally at Cats Protection or as a sector? What do you think needs to change there in order to modernise that, make that more effective?
I'm not sure it's changed, Zoe. I think it may be evolution. I have been lucky enough and privileged to work in a number of charities over the years that have rich histories in volunteers and staff co-creating. We may not have used that term, but I think that's the term that we would use now. I think at the heart there is something about the sharing of mission and vision and power in order to achieve really exciting things. And that's not about compromise, because compromise to me sounds like people giving up power. It's more about this. I love this term, co-creation, because it's about people bringing all their rich experiences and all their expertise to the table and working out how that can be combined in the most powerful way to have the biggest impact for a charity. Now, that can be rife with challenge, because there will always be the politics of organizations to have to navigate. But when you get it right, when the alchemy is right, amazing things can happen. And I'm really, really excited to begin to see that happening in a new way within the animal welfare sector and specifically within Cats Protection, where we've had volunteers and staff working together in various parts of the charity very, very successfully for many years. We have branches of volunteers across the country who are rehoming cats and running neutering programs and helping the general population to understand about the species. What perhaps we haven't done is to take that expertise and experience into the warp and weft of the decision-making and governance of the organisation right the way through it, so that the voice of the volunteer and staff member are heard and listened to everywhere within the organisation. So that focus, if you like, on end user centricity, because I think distinguishing between volunteer and staff can often be a bit of a red herring. I think it's more about the people who are looking directly to make an impact through their actions need to be at the centre of the decision making that goes on to ensure that their needs are properly met as we work for the beneficiaries of the organisation as a whole.
And that's quite a significant shift in power, isn't it, for a lot of charities?
Yeah, and it is that desire to share decision making rather than work in a highly hierarchical way is one that is quite easy to talk about and not necessarily so easy to really make happen in practice. And one of the things that I'm holding on to with colleagues who share this desire with me and with the board of the charity that chose to ask me to help to lead this work is that we're all in it for the long haul. Change of this kind, I don't think is achieved quickly. I think you can create processes that will hardwire behaviors, but they won't necessarily be owned unless you really work through them with people and they grow organically. And that means that we've got to give the space for conversations to happen, for us to think about what the future might look like, to try some things out and maybe not always succeed, and not be afraid that sometimes things won't go quite as we might have originally hoped, but to keep in mind that end goal, that idea of the values that we want to hold, the courage we want to have, the empathy we want to show, the desire to ultimately make a difference to cats, because that's why we're here. Hold all that hard in our hearts, and then look at changing that power shift that you've described to a position where we're all recognizing that what we're doing is working together to build something quite special.
Is the slight danger in that sort of approach that you create another layer, if that makes sense, because you've got the board of trustees, and then you've got the volunteers, and then you've got the paid employees as well? Is that the big challenge, is the integration of those three groups so that you have that combined mission across all of it?
It's interesting, Paul. I don't think it is about layers, but I think I mean, you use the term integration, and I think that's the piece we really have to concentrate on. It isn't about creating a massively hierarchical set of layers and structures.
No.
It's about recognizing that in all the decisions that we choose to make, we make sure that the voices that need to be heard are part of that process. I mean, I'm a great believer in giving people the opportunity to make decisions and be accountable for the decisions that they've made without having to have massive sign-off up and down a management line. But the responsibility that goes with that is that if you are accountable for a decision, then you have the responsibility to search out the voices to help inform that decision that are the right ones to look for. And traditionally, the way that you do that is you talk to your direct reports, and you talk to those to whom you report, and you'd think of 2 or 3 stakeholders, and you'd grab them and you'd ask them, and that would be about it. I think it is much more healthy to start from a point of view of saying, who are the people who are really going to help me to make the right decision? Let me talk to those people, understand their points of view, recognize that we're not running, and I forget the correct term, but you know, not everybody has a right to the decision. There is nobody who's there to who has direct veto or whose voice is above anybody else's. But I, as decision maker, have to make sure that I've listened hard to those people who may have a stake in the game. so it's not. So it does add more complexity, and it does mean that decisions may take longer sometimes. But I think what it does is it means that those decisions are, first of all, better ones, but that also they are more sustainable because they're rooted within the life of the charity and the work that it wants to do, not simply the result of some management processes or tick boxes that are looking for a quick win.
Yeah, and I can see it exactly. So I'm a trustee for a very small local charity. And I was brought in, Zoe and I have had these conversations in the past. We've been brought in to be trustees on charities because of our digital experience, for example. So, what can we bring to the table that's not been there before? And I can tell sometimes with my fellow trustees that when I start to talk, they glaze over because it's not a world that they understand, which is the very reason why I was brought in the first place. But I do know within a very small organisation who the people are to go and have those conversations with to unlock the support and the help that I need to make or help the charity make those decisions. But you've got a pool of 11,000 people there that you can say, right, this is the topic, this is the conversation, this is the decision we need to make, who's going to jump on board and help with that in a way that makes that much more about getting the right expertise into the right room for the right conversation to hopefully lead to the right outcome.
Yeah, it's exactly that. And it's trusting that the people that you get into the room are going to be the people who are going to be able to find the answers. And we're only just beginning to start looking at how that might work. So at the moment, like so many charities, we're facing challenges in terms of financial stability and sustainability. So one of the things that we've been doing is looking at where our sustainability lies as an organisation, what we should be doing more of, what we should be doing less of. Perhaps there are projects that we should pause at the moment, and projects that we should accelerate. Now, traditionally, the way that we'd make those decisions would be that a senior leadership team would talk with trustees and undertake some research and then make a decision on that basis. What we're choosing to do at the moment is to have a working group, a task and finish group of folks from a variety of parts of the charity who have particular expertise, including a volunteer voice, to ask that question and to make recommendations. And some of that feels quite challenging because you're asking people to work together and have a stake on decisions and recommendations that they would not necessarily traditionally have been asked to have a view of, such a high stake view on. But the positive of that is that the people who are really at the heart of implementing any decisions that are made, and frankly are the powerhouse of the organization, are the very people who are part of that decision making process. And that feels more equitable. It feels challenging, and it perhaps feels a bit messier than a traditional hierarchical decision making process. And of course, you have to wrap around it governance to protect decision making and make sure it's appropriate within, in our case, a very large charity. But it feels like that piece of let's cooperate, let's co-create, and let's understand each other's points of view in a very grown-up way that I think is very exciting for the future of an organisation.
Sounds very exciting indeed. And one of the things which will obviously be necessary for that is creating the right culture for the change you want to see. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, we started before I joined the organisation, going right back to having conversations around what are the values that we as an organisation want to hold. Now, lots and lots of organizations do that, and they talk about values, and then those values get put on a PowerPoint slide somewhere, and they're only referenced perhaps when you come to write the annual report. We've chosen a number of values, and I used some of the words that we've used. I'm not going to list them all because every organization will create its own. But we talk about being all for cats. We talk about the need to be courageous in our decisions, and a number of other things. All of those we are tested on, and sometimes fall short every day. But we genuinely, I think, institutionally want to hold those values. And if we can put those at the center of the decision making, then those values turn into principles, or they inform principles for decision making, which then create a framework that we can all use, so that we're not simply relying upon our own particular compass, but we have a shared compass to be able to find our direction. So at the heart of the creation of our strategy has been the redefining of the language around the values and behaviours that we believe are appropriate for our charity, and for cats protection specifically. And from that have then come lots of the other things that you may have been seeing happening through the press over the last couple of years. Not least, our rebrand, the way in which our advocacy work is becoming even more important than it was before, and I think what will become very interesting over the coming years will be our education strategy, as we begin to try to really make a difference to all those owned cats. I think there are something like 11 million owned cats in the UK. So that's that. But at the heart has got to be, how do we want to behave? How do we want to live our charity?
And that makes a lot of sense, actually. And it's really refreshing to hear about a charity that's truly living its values and holding itself accountable to those values as well. And on that point about the education strategy, we'd love to hear more about that. Can you tell our listeners a bit more on that one?
Well, the answer is no, because there's more to come. I think one of the most challenging things about strategy development is that there is an assumption that you write a strategy, everything is clear about what you want to do, and then you go off and implement it. And I'm not sure that that's really the case anymore. I think we know what our objectives are, but we also know that we quite deliberately have set ourselves a 10-year time frame. And one of the things that we have wanted to do is to make sure that we get the foundations of our work absolutely solid before we begin to build really new activity. And education, I think, is in that area of newness, where we don't yet have a clear idea about how we're going to achieve the human behaviour change that we want to see. What we know that education isn't is purely the work that we do in schools. And whilst we're extremely proud of the presence that we have in the nation's schools, whether that's with early years pupils learning about how to look after pets perhaps for the first time, right the way through to the work that we do with apprentices and careers advice to those looking to work in animal welfare. There is a bigger story to tell around that human behaviour change, and how we get into every household in the country, and we haven't yet begun to answer that question. We've begun to put in place the foundations that will help us. So one of those has been the rebranding of the organisation in recent months, and we might want to talk a little bit more about that in the next few minutes. Putting in place an understanding of the fact that we want to reach a much wider group of people than we have done in the past has been really, really important. But we're genuinely, I think, accepting that there's a bit of cathedral theory to be followed here, and that we are the custodians, each of us involved in the charity at the moment, we're the custodians of building something that is undoubtedly going to last long after any of us have been involved in the charity. And so what we want to do is to make sure that we build sustainably and we build sensibly, and that we build with a view to the future, not a case of just putting in place some simple tactical activity that's relatively short-lived, which is a long way of answering a question that says, at the moment, we don't know what our education strategy is going to look like, but we're excited to find out.
And it's interesting because we should have discussed this just before we came on, but today I've just seen the relaunch, the video for the RSPCA.
Isn't it great?
Oh, it's amazing, absolutely amazing. And I wonder whether there is something here about redefining, and this is going to be a bit of a rambly. I'm not even sure it's a question, but let's see how we get there. But there's a sense of since COVID of a redefinition of our relationship with animals. I think we had a cat from Cats Protection during lockdown, and unfortunately he was involved in an accident shortly afterwards and was killed. And the relationship we built up with that little cat over those 2 years or so through COVID was unbelievable in such a short space of time. And that meant that, we really redefined our idea as a family of what animals meant to us. And we didn't go straight out and get another cat because we wanted to have that cat, because that cat had a place in our hearts. It had special needs that we needed to attend to, and all of those sorts of things. But it meant that we took a really hard look at the way we looked at animals and our responsibility towards animals. The kids here, I don't know how you cope with this, Zoe, but the kids in my family always say, "Oh, could we get a dog? Or could we get another cat?" and all this sort of stuff. We keep coming back to the responsibility that it takes to look after that. And wasn't it wonderful to have Prince while he was alive? But also the responsibility that came with that during the during the week, during the day, and the role that they play. And I just wonder, alongside something like the RSPCA advert, whether that is looking at the wider public. And I've had lots of stories about dogs and the proliferation of dogs through lockdown, and people's inability to afford to look after them and all of that kind of stuff. Whether that's a point for us to look at is redefining our relationship with these animals that are a big important part of the families we're building.
Yeah, whether it's a redefinition, Paul, or whether it's a rediscovery of the relationship that already in so many places is a pretty darned good one, but making sure that relationship is more widespread, I don't know. I do know that we continue to struggle, and families continue to struggle with circumstances that lead to their relationship with their pet having to change. And you talk about a really, I'm so sorry to hear of Prince's accident, but we know that a lot of pets were adopted over the period of lockdown. We also know that there have been quite a considerable number of relinquishments to rehoming centres after lockdown as people's lives changed again. And understanding the responsibility of living with a companion animal is something that needs to be part of the decision making to have or not have a pet. I think we're in a bit of a perfect storm at the moment, because not only do we have the challenge of folks having to realign their lives as they return to a new normal, but what we also have is a cost of living crisis that has made looking after pets for some people a really heartbreaking situation where they're simply not in a position to be able to do so. And I think part of what we must do, of course, is to work with people whenever we possibly can to help cats, because that's who we work with, cats stay in families and not come into shelters, because generally, it will always be better for a cat not to be in a shelter for any length of time, because it's not the environment that cats ought to be in. But we should not be judging those who, for whatever circumstances they may find themselves in, just can't continue the relationship that they started. So that, you said you weren't quite sure whether you were asking a question or whether it was just a sort of rambling bit of stuff. It's a bit of a rambling answer too, but there is something in there. At the moment, Cats Protection serves about 157,000 cats a year in one way or another. The job we have to do over the coming 8 to 10 years is to shift that to being many millions, but it isn't necessarily direct activity with those animals. It's the way in which we change that relationship with companion animals that we've been talking about during this conversation.
That makes an awful lot of sense. And we just have one final question for you, if that would be okay. So this is a leadership podcast. We like to think that we are helping leaders to think about redefining their roles and the future of leadership. What advice would you give leaders if they're embarking on this role of starting to look at co-designing the future of their organisations?
It comes back to that bit about cathedral theory, I think, and it's a sort of blinding glimpse of the obvious. But there are some changes that can happen swiftly, but much sustainable change takes much longer than we may at first think it will. And to be comfortable with that, I think, is a really important part of having an understanding of your own leadership and the impact that you can have. That if you're going to co-create, then that takes time to build relationships. It takes a messiness of conversation that you need to feel comfortable with, and you need to be ready to navigate the frustrations that you yourself will feel, but also your colleagues will feel, because everybody wants to make an impact and have change now. And I guess it is counterintuitive. We as leaders, we want to make an impact. We are impatient for change, but often change, to be truly embedded, needs to take time, needs to have patience, needs to be gently cajoled rather than imposed, and needs to be owned by everybody. And you don't own change by imposing it on folks.
That sounds an awful lot like the relationship humans have with cats.
I suppose you're right. Although I'm just trying to think whether Blenheim actually owns any change whatsoever, or whether cats live in the moment, and that's what's so wonderful about them. They don't have long, detailed memories of challenges that have existed in the past, and they don't have a view of what anything, even the immediate future, might look like. They just do. And actually, that is where we are different as human beings. We can have that vision of the future, and we can work towards it, and we can know that the little things that we're doing will contribute to a change that is right for the future. So whilst there are obvious links to make, I think actually there is a serious difference here, because human change, you understand that there's a future to work towards, and that might be quite long term. If you're a cat and suddenly you're faced with being put in a shelter, well then suddenly for that period your total life is the amount of space that you've now got. And that's why we want to keep cats out of shelters, not because 8 to 10 weeks on they might be in the right place again. That's great. The cat, when it goes into that pen for the first time, doesn't recognize that. Yeah. And maybe what we've got to do as human beings with change, if we're going to carry on the analogy, is just help people to understand that whilst we might be going into a pen for a short time, we are going to come out the other side. And as we do, the situation will be better. So, a very, very good point.
Well, thank you. That's a great way to wrap up, and a great conversation. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you so much, John. That was great. And it's really made me think about how everything we need to know about leadership, we need to involve cats in the process as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much to John for making the time to come on Starts at the Top and share his insight with us. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We've included some details of Cats Protection in our show notes, and as I said, a charity that does mean quite a lot to this household, at least.
Yes, thank you so much to John. I found that a really interesting and really fun conversation, and what I've always liked about John is the way he talks about leadership, but he holds it very lightly in a way that I think is actually very skillful. And it's really interesting to hear his reflections on organisational culture and changes to ways of working. So thank you so much, John, for coming on, especially at a time when I know he was very busy. So we really appreciate him making us on his diary to come and have a chat with us.
Yes, and as always, we really do appreciate that you have all stayed all the way through and listened to the end of this episode, so thank you very much. You can support the podcast by leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to us. It really does help us to reach more people, so if you've enjoyed what you've heard, do share us with a friend.
Thank you so much for listening today, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks with a brand new episode of Starts at the Top.
See you then, and bye for now.